And I am David Sofield of the English Department at Amherst College, where I've taught for 45 years, and I'm sitting with Richard Wilbur, possibly the most distinguished living alumnus of Amherst College, on April 7th, 2010, which promises to be the warmest April 7th in the history of Amherst. It's supposed to reach 88 degrees this afternoon, and we're talking in the morning. I got to know Dick a little circuitously originally, because the first time that he and I ever had a real conversation, and I'm going to talk here for a couple of minutes before I ask Dick a question to introduce this. Dick was giving a reading at Amherst maybe around 1980 or the very early 1980s, I'm not sure. He's given many readings at the college over his very long career. And I happened to be seated at dinner next to Dick's wonderful wife, Charlie, in the Lord Jeff, on a spring day, a lot like this one, warm, I remember. And it was a big table, and Dick was at the other end, so I wasn't talking to him. But Charlie and I had a very warm conversation, as Charlie had very warm conversations with a great many people. And she and I became friends, as well as Dick and I. I became friends of them together. And in the middle of the conversation, she said to me, "Do you by any chance play tennis?" And I said, "I do," which I do. And she said, "Would you like to come out to our house sometime in Cummington and be Dick's partner in a doubles game?" which goes on periodically, or went on periodically at their house. They have the world's most challenging tennis court at the house. And I said, "Sure." And so that summer I went out there and kept going out there for years and years and playing tennis with Dick and other people who've become great friends of his and mine, in fact. And I still play tennis with the person I met on that court. Anyway, this is not about tennis, it's about Dick and Charlie. But the friendship developed over now I would think about 3 decades, and it became a friendship in poetry as well as a friendship in tennis and a friendship generally, to the point where 2 years ago the president of the college, Tony Marks, sent me an email, having already been in touch with Dick, asking him if he would like to be the Simpson lecturer at the college. This would mean in succession, although obviously not in immediate succession, to Robert Frost, whose bust is over here, and you can't see it on those of you watching and listening to this interview, but there is a bust. We're in the alumni house at the college. Tony Marks, in that invitation to Dick to become a Simpson lecturer, which is an appointment without term. It's the most special faculty position at Amherst College. Frost held it for a long, long while. A couple of other people have held it in the interim. And I was in Rome on sabbatical with my wife, Lisa, and having a fine time. And it comes an email from Tony Marks saying, "Would you please encourage Dick Wilbur to accept the Simpson lectureship?" And so he said, so I said back to that I would indeed encourage Dick to do it if he wanted to do it. And I got in touch with Dick, who does not do email. I want it known right now. So don't try to email him, although he has a college email address. He doesn't do email. And Dick said he would do it if he and I could teach together. And so we've been teaching together for 2 years now, and right after this interview, this is a Wednesday at now 10:15 in the morning, 10:05 in the morning, we have a class in writing poetry. We've also done a couple of other things. We've done a class in great 17th century lyric poets, and a class in poetry, a seminar for English majors, and another seminar this past fall in poetry from the middle of the 20th century to the present. In that second course, Dick doesn't let us do him much, or the one day that I insisted that we do him, he insisted on not being there. So it worked out perfectly well. So I turned to Dick, and my thought, Dick, and we've talked about this a little bit before this occasion, would be, since you've been interviewed so often about your career as a poet, which interviews are widely available, I thought it might be best, since this is for the Amherst College Archives and the Oral History Project, for you to do some talking about what the college has been to you and for you over a very long time now. Must be 71 years or so. But this is also an interview about you as the writer you are. And so I would ask you first to reflect a little, if you would, on your childhood and your schooling before you came to Amherst in the fall of 1938 on that remarkable day. The day Dick arrived at Amherst, he'll tell this story, was the hurricane day. I believe he'll tell this story. So talk a bit about family, if you would, and schooling before Amherst, and then we'll talk about Amherst.
In the early days of me, there was very little talk about college, and nobody in my family had ever gone to college. My mother's family was from Baltimore, and she came of a long line of newspaper editors and newspaper writers, and journalism was favorably considered always in my household, and therefore writing was an honorable profession. My father had come east from Nebraska as a quite young man and put himself through the Art Students League in New York. That was his equivalent of college, and indeed it was a very good school. He studied with Robert Henry and John Sloan and Bellows and people of that of that class, and went on to be, for half of his career, a very successful commercial artist, and then quit on that. He was tired of the limitations of lithography, for one thing, and became a portrait artist, and did some wonderful work in that vein as well. My father was an amiable man, and an English millionaire named Joshua Dickinson Armitage ran into him on a golf course somewhere. I don't know where this happened. But Mr. Armitage took a shine to my father, and before long we were living in a rented pre-revolutionary stone house on Mr. Armitage's gentleman's farm out in North Caldwell, New Jersey. It was quite a big farm. It was 450 acres, as I remember, and it had on it everything that a farm should have, all of the necessary animals, and orchards of everything that you might want. And it was rather good to find myself from age 2 onward growing up in such a place, especially because it was a gentleman's farm, the farm of a retired industrialist with an English background. It also had 2 bowling greens and 1 tennis court. And so very early I was breaking in for those games that you and I got to playing later on. That my parents somehow wangled permission for me to be educated at the best schools in the vicinity. I'm not talking about private schools, but I did my elementary education in Essex Fells, New Jersey, 2.5 miles from the country town in which I lived. And then I did my high school work at Montclair High School, 7 miles away from where I lived, and rather a long day's travel, actually. And that was an excellent high school, so good that any graduate of Montclair tended to be accepted like that at any college. That's what happened to me. Well,
What did you do? Were you active in the literary circles, as it were, in the high school?
Yes. I started right in wanting to be a writer of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I've told you in the past, I published my first poem at the age of 8 in a kind of high-toned kids magazine called John Martin's Book. There was a page in that magazine called the All Around the Table Club, where the little subscribers were encouraged competitively to contribute. And I think actually they published 2 little poems of mine. I was paid $1 for each one, and of course I've kept the dollar. And by the time I was in high school, I was attempting all kinds of writing, as well as a good deal of drawing and caricature, poster making. I became the editor of the high school newspaper in Montclair, and I was elected to some kind of senior class office. I forget what it was, but in any case, those 2 things probably helped my application to Amherst when it came. I don't know whether I've ever told you about why I went to Amherst.
I don't remember that you have.
Well, my parents had a very good friend named Louis Wakely, Louis E. Wakely, if I'm not mistaken. He was an Amherst graduate, and he was in every way an Amherst enthusiast. He felt Amherst had made him what he was, and he thought I could do with a bit of the same going over. Yeah. My parents didn't know anything about the college world, nor did I. With my father and mother, I made a northward trip to have a look at Amherst, and it looked very much as it does now, if one forgets that we have been overrun by cars.
College and town alike.
Yes. And so I applied for Amherst and was accepted. And Mr. Wakely's enthusiasms were not only for Amherst and for Amherst athletics, in which he had participated, but also for Chi Psi fraternity. Ah. Yes. I was to go to Amherst and I was to join Chi Psi fraternity. And I obediently did so.
Right. So tell us about the day you arrived.
The day I arrived was the day when the great hurricane struck New England. And I remember when I was, where I was when the first gusts came. I was standing in the hall at North Dormitory on the first floor. And I dare say it's still true that the big doors of North Dormitory are very thick, and they have inset windows of thick glass. And through the thick glass of that door, I remember seeing a great hallucination. Suddenly, the big trees of the senior grove were swaying and then subsiding, lying down. Of course, it wasn't too long that was a soundless experience, but I didn't hear any noise
Yeah,
at
because you're
first.
behind the thick door.
And but yes, I guess the door was preventing my hearing it. And in any case, the wind soon made itself known.
Yeah.
And so our initial day, I'm speaking of the hurricane class as we came to be called, was a day in which a great wind blew, and we began the process of picking up after it. I think this meant that there was a delay in the fraternity rushing program, which always was the first event of the fall. But we picked up slates and we sawed up trees, carried branches around for a couple of days, and then we settled this important matter of fraternity membership.
Which has meant a good deal to you over the decades.
I
mean, you made friends in the fraternity that you've...
Yes.
That
Yes.
friends.
I guess David, I don't think I went into the fact that I had, because I was living out on a farm and going to school at some distance, I didn't really have a neighborhood childhood. And so, though the farm was a wonderful place to grow up, there was just an edge of loneliness to my childhood. And so it was wonderful to find myself taken into the prescribed fraternity, Chi Psi, and to find that I had 50 instant brothers, all of whom were very brotherly to me. And it made a great difference to me as a social animal to be almost at once taken into a fraternity at Amherst and made social.
Did you live in the fraternity in later years?
In later years, yes. There's a good deal to be said against the fraternities, of course. And they were isolating. But I have memories of considerable comfort in the isolation of the Chi Psi Lodge, which I think is now called Mayo Smith Hall.
It is.
Yes. We, from sophomore year on, members of that fraternity lived with a roommate or two in the building, and we ate our meals in a great hall from long tables. I waited on the tables a good deal myself because to some extent I wanted to work my way through college, as it was rather easy to do in those days.
But what did you do in the summers? I know you went around the country to some extent, did you not, on the rails?
Yes, that's right.
There's a poem about it. And
I can't quite explain why I wanted to do it, except that I had a considerable spirit of adventure. And but on one of the summers of my college career, I hoboed mostly on the rails when necessary with my thumb, through 46 of the 48 states.
Wow.
And it was great fun, and I was too dumb to know how dangerous it was. I stayed out of Georgia and Florida because those states were said to put people on the chain gang if they were classifiable as vagrants.
Uh-huh. Good thing.
But I had lots of the adventures which one has in going on the road. I slept in hobo jungles and so on. The a second summer, because I came back to Amherst and shot my mouth off about my adventures of the of the previous summer, two of my friends from Amherst volunteered to come with me on a second tour of the then 48 states.
Again, avoiding Georgia and Florida?
Yes, no Georgia, no Florida.
Right.
The three of us almost came to grief in Macomb, Mississippi, but I won't go into that story. we all survived and had adventures and had a good time and got back safely.
Good, good.
George Schenck was one of them. He was a member of my fraternity and at one time one of my roommates. And Tom Wilcox,
A lifelong friend.
who was a lifelong friend of mine, was the other of my companions. I corresponded fairly regularly with my family and also with Charlie, whom I had met by the time I was taking a second jaunt around America.
Well, we're going to talk about Charlie in a moment, but I didn't realize that. I didn't know when you'd met her. The Amherst and your time, which was fall 1938 to June 1942, a date to ponder because the war, America was in the war by that time. Your Amherst, I'm thinking, I don't know exactly, and I'm not the historian to know, but I think may have had something like 600 students, the college.
I thought it was larger than that.
Was it 800?
Thought it was closer to 800, but I could be quite wrong.
No, you may well be right. I know there was, at some point it went from 600 to 800 and 800 to 1100, which it was when I came to Amherst in the fall of 1965, and then went up incrementally with the institution of coeducation and to the present something like 1600. It's going to go, I guess, to 1700. But a college of 800 is half the size of Amherst now, the Amherst that you've come back to as a faculty member.
Yes, though I'm happy to say it doesn't seem crowded.
Yeah.
Whatever the number was, one did have a sense of knowing
Sure.
everybody to some extent. I imagine this partly had to do with the with the silly classification system that the fraternities offered. In other words, one knew a lot of people in a distorted way, considering them to be Jack the Deke or Minor the...
Did you take English department classes from the beginning?
Yes. I had a slight mishap at the very start. There was some sort of a test intended to discover your competence in English. And if you did well on it, you were excused the extraordinary course that Theodore Baird and others had been putting together.
Yes.
I forget what that was called, English A or English 1.
I think it was English A before it was English 1, so it might have been English A in your time.
Yes.
And it didn't become a requirement of all freshmen until after World War II. But a version was being offered when you were a freshman.
Yes, and I know people like my friend Tom Wilcox were greatly excited by that
For good
course.
reason.
And but because I was excused, I went and had a course instead, a freshman English course with David Morton, a member of the faculty who was an amiable, charming poet, but not a challenging teacher. So I'm sorry to have missed out on the English A experience.
Well.
But of course, the teachers who were making that course so stimulating were around for my sophomore year, and I took Mr. Baird's course in Shakespeare and in 18th century literature, and I took Armour Craig's very first course, which was taught at a forbidding hour, 7-something in the morning.
He was young, you were young.
It was his very first course, and it was a course in 17th century prose. I think it was in that course that I first was given a sense that without the intervention of a teacher, I could just look at a page of writing from the 17th century and interact with it. Many students, because they listen to lectures and read outlines and
Now get it off Google.
Yes.
Right.
Many students do not quite get to that point of feeling that they can read a poem by John Donne as if it had just been written, and, as I said, interact with it. I'm very grateful to the challenges that Theodore Baird gave us all,
Sure.
and to what Armour Craig somehow gave me. There were other fine teachers in the English department. George Roy Eliot was a very amiable and scholarly teacher of 19th century and romantic poetry. And George Frisbee Whitcher, who
That's a real middle name, by the way, Frisbee.
Yes, George Frisbee Whitcher, who about the time I was at Amherst was publishing the very first good book about Emily Dickinson called This Was a Poet. George Frisbee Whitcher was more of a performer, I think, than any of my teachers were. He could read poems beautifully, and I can remember the great wonder of hearing him recite Vachel Lindsay's Brian, 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 Brian. The whole poem, all 6 sections of it. And I've loved that poem ever since.
I have heard you recite parts of that poem
Yes.
in class
Yes.
and over lunch. Yeah. Did you do a thesis?
Excuse me?
Did you do a thesis? Were theses done in those days?
They were, I think, but I was not eligible. And I had a nice note from Mr. Eliot round about my junior year saying, your grades don't justify your writing a thesis as an English major. But I want you to know that we in the English department have made note of your growing seriousness. What I had done with myself largely was writing this or that kind of thing. I was aiming from the beginning to become the editor of The Student if I could. At least I wanted to work on our undergraduate newspaper. and I wrote short stories, columns, poems for the undergraduate magazine Touchstone.
And drawings.
Drawings as
Yep.
well, yes. And all that meant that I was somewhat distracted from my
Yeah. Sure. Well, that's still the
regular
case. If you
courses.
work in the Amherst student, you have to give up something else in order to do it because it's
Yes.
very demanding of your time.
What I especially gave up was sports, and though I was in a fraternity which had, I think, the entire lineup of the football team in it. We were a jock fraternity, although there were lots of non-jocks in the brotherhood. And
Understand that a football team in those days was 11 people, not 22, much less.
yes,
80, I think, are now in the Amherst College squad, maybe 70.
that's right. They played. Whoever played it played both
Sure.
offense and defense.
Right.
And I was one of the brothers who did not become conspicuously athletic. As a freshman, I went down to the gymnasium, and Tug Kennedy, who was the swimming coach and also had been a boxer in the Navy, showed me what a left jab was by jabbing me, and I did a bit of boxing until the day when Gene Hubbard, who was the center of our football team and a member of Chi Psi, said to me, "How are you doing, Dick?" And I said, "Well, I'm enjoying things very much. Of course, my head rings a little at night." And he said, "From what?" And I said, "Well, from boxing." And he said, "Look, you quit boxing. We took you into this fraternity to raise our academic average." So I
So you quit boxing.
dutifully quit that sport, at which I wasn't a natural. I had actually not quite enough desire to hurt anybody.
Oh, well, not to your discredit. So you met Charlie when you were a sophomore or a junior?
She was in the class of 43 at Smith.
Right.
And I'm fuzzy about dates, as a man of 89 is entitled to be.
Yes.
But I know that my roommate, one of my roommates, Brooks Beck, said to me one day that he was going to arrange a date with a wonderfully suitable girl in Sessions House at Smith. And I took him up on it, went over at the appointed time to Smith and Sessions House and sat in a room they called the Fuzzer's Parlor. The idea was that you were an awkward swain, and it was your business to writhe in a chair until the girls appeared. Well, when Charlie came through the door, I know this sounds stupidly poetic, but when she came through the door, I was in love with her right away. And happily, she took a favorable view of me. And that went on, of course, for 60-odd years. We were married in June, immediately after my graduation from Amherst. Charlie passed up her senior year at Smith, and I think we were almost the first married couple to come out of the class of 42, and probably the first to have a child. We had a daughter, Ellen, almost immediately.
And there was some urgency in those days because the war was on, and your classmates were likely to be drafted, as they were indeed drafted. And
Yes, and some had volunteered and left the college early. People, Ed Gilson had gone into the Marines. He was to die on one of those damned islands in the Pacific. Julie Desti had gone off to fly for the RAF, I think, or the Canadian Air Force. Well, many people,
Yeah.
some people had left before formal graduation. And we all had to figure out something to do. Something kept me from wanting to be a 90-day wonder, kept me from wanting to go into one of those
yeah. Officer
officer training
yeah.
programs. It probably had something to do with the fact that all during my younger years, I'd been pro-labor and pro-New Deal, and I didn't want to take advantage, I think, of my collegiate standing. That's a guess at my motive.
Yeah, yeah.
I
You
was
were
a-
involved in leftist circles, right, to a degree, as an undergraduate?
A little bit, a little bit. I don't know what the political flavor of Amherst was when I was an undergraduate. I suspect that most of my classmates came from Republican households.
Sure.
So I seemed, whenever I opened my mouth and talked about politics, I seemed more leftist than I really was. I think I was just an enthusiast of Franklin Roosevelt and his programs. And also, as I said, I was pro-labor and in favor of the unions. The habit of thinking and feeling in that way, I think, made me rather readier to go into the Army as a private
Sure.
than someone else might have.
Before we leave the college and your experience at it when you were a student, would you want to say a little more about the Amherst Student newspaper and what you did for it, and what being editor meant, and what kind of writing you did? And
As I remember, those who were competing for the editorship did writing of all kinds for the paper, but regularly wrote editorials and submitted them to the existing editor. I submitted my editorials to Bob Morgenthau, who was the who was the editor
wow,
of
immediately before you?
the paper immediately before me.
Wow.
And I probably had some advantages with Bob because I had joined him in an organization of his foundation called the Political Union, the main function of which was to bring speakers to the campus. I remember we sponsored a lecture by Norman Thomas, the
Excellent.
perpetual
Socialist
socialist
candidate, right.
I must say that I had never been, in my own eyes or in anybody else's eyes, of any interest as a political thinker. And so I'm not particularly proud of the editorials which I wrote and submitted to Bob, some of which he published. I don't suppose they're disgraceful, but I think they were they were for me writing exercises rather than specimens of real serious political thought.
The war had started, of course, by then in Europe in '39. So your senior year, when you were editor, was the academic year 1941-42.
Yes.
So,
So that's when
with
we
the
finally,
prospect of your classmates and yourself facing the likelihood of military service.
I wrote a number of articles and editorials, rather sassily opposing our involvement in World War II. And then, of course, I wrote an extremely concessive editorial when Pearl Harbor occurred and there was no longer anything to discuss.
Yes, right, right. Right after graduation, I want to come to the poetry in a second, and maybe I should actually interject at this point the question, did you write any poems while you were an Amherst student that are in the New and Collected? I'm assuming not.
No.
You really began writing during the war.
When I was at Amherst, I was trying to advance on all fronts as a writer, of course.
Right.
And I think I had one poem maybe in the Touchstone, the undergraduate literary magazine. And I did write poems not for publication. Sent quite a few to Charlie.
I was going to imagine that.
During the time of our courtship.
Right.
But didn't become serious about it until World War II, and for the most obvious reasons. Although American soldiers overseas were furnished with wonderful paperbacks by the Army. They had been selected by a fine non-Army committee in the States, and these armed services editions, as they were called, made good reading wherever one was, and many a soldier threw out his gas mask and to make room for one of the armed service editions. In a foxhole, what you could do was to read, and that was better than cleaning your rifle over and over again. And the other thing you could do was to write. And this is true not only of me, but of the armed services generally. People began to write poems. General, one of the generals, I can't think of the name of that general who, MacArthur, yes.
General MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur.
Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur once said, "There are no atheists in the foxholes." Well, there were certainly no non-poets in the foxholes. Everybody was writing poems. People who were utterly surprised by themselves were doing that. And the Armed Forces newspaper,
Stars and Stripes?
the Stars and Stripes, had, in almost every issue, it seems to me, a box in the corner of the editorial page headed "Pup Tent Poets." And the poems that flooded the Stars and Stripes office were mostly not very good, but they were being written by everybody.
Yeah. So I know that it's a long story about your military service, and I know that your friend and mine, Bob Bagg of the Amherst class of 1957, has recently contracted to write your biography and has completed a long, long chapter on your
Yes.
experiences in the Second World War, and you've claimed to me that he knows more about it than you do.
I think he does.
Certainly about the larger war that
Yes,
you were.
what they call the big picture is
Yes.
what Bob knows that I don't.
Yeah. But where were you exactly? I know you were in the invasion of Italy. That must have come from, this is real ignorance on my part, but from North Africa. Were you in North Africa and then
Well,
you came up
actually,
the Italian peninsula?
actually, let's see. I was sent at a time when the army was confused as to whether to classify me as suspected of disloyalty for my supposed radical views.
That's why I asked you about leftist circles at Amherst College.
Yes. Well, I guess whatever I had in the way of liberal, leftist, New Dealing opinions did do me some harm in the army. I had been originally trained first as an infantryman, then as a cryptographer, and at a certain point, when I was hanging out in a secret camp in Warrenton, Virginia, the word came through that I was to be sent to a kind of a dumping ground, a camp called Shenango, where undesirables of all kinds were sent to await shipment as general replacements to Europe. Well, I went then as a general replacement from Shenango to North Africa.
Yeah.
And waited there rather briefly to be taken somewhere else.
But as a member at this point of the Signal Corps?
I guess that my signal training was on my service record, but I think I was going to be sent very likely into an infantry company with no training in the Garand rifle. I had trained.
Because you were writing poems, not cleaning it.
Yes. Yes. Well, while I was waiting around briefly in North Africa, the landing at Salerno occurred, and what later became my division, the 36th Texas Division, was, of course, part of that. Then when I was shipped over to Italy as a general replacement, a good many of us undesirables were ushered into a great racetrack called the Ippodromo Dagnano near Naples. And this was a place where they looked at your service record and assigned you to this or that. I was walking across this enormous encampment of a racetrack to volunteer for the paratroops, which would have given me some training, you know, with
I've never been able to imagine parachuting.
Well, I hadn't done much imagining of parachuting, but I think I was right to fear that I was not well enough trained with the Garand rifle and with other infantry skills to go right into the front line. And the paratroops would have given me some training.
Yeah.
And so I had decided to volunteer for them. And I and a couple of other people of the same mind were walking across the hippodrome when my name was called by a PA system. And I reported to Captain Wingo of the divisional 36 Division's Signal Company. And I've since turned it into a bit of vaudeville, but it really was rather like this. I stepped into his tent, saluted, and said, "Private Wilbur, reporting for duty," and Captain Wingo said, "Private Wilbur, it says here you want to overthrow the government." And I said,
On a racetrack in Naples, this is happening.
Yes.
This is great.
And I said, "No, sir, I don't want to overthrow the government." And he said, "Well, we've just lost one of our cryptographers, and we need one in our signal company. So you can come into the company. If we catch you overthrowing the government, out you'll go." It was something like that. I've refined the comedy a little.
Don't change it.
In
That's
retelling
perfect.
it. And so I found myself in the 36th Division serving with largely Texans, who, of course, are the best soldiers in the world, and feeling at once oddly at home. And we fought our way up the Italian peninsula. We had the privilege of taking Rome, and then we went beyond it a little bit, I think to Civitavecchia, and then were told to go back down south and prepare for the southern France invasion, which we did. And we landed near Fréjus and San Rafael in an invasion which, because the Germans had in many ways pulled back and were short on airplane fuel, which was a comparatively bloodless landing. And so we then went up the middle of France and into the Vosges and were part of the final push into Germany.
You were involved in Monte Cassino?
Oh, yes.
Could you say a word about that?
No, I didn't. Yes. Monte Cassino was my first experience, really, of active combat. And we were, our signal company was dug into a side of the valley facing the mountain on which the Abbey of Monte Cassino stood. And we were very, very vulnerable, and the Germans at that time were firing 88s with as harassing fire, for heaven's sake.
Harassing indeed.
Yes. And so we spent a lot of time in holes in the ground, except when we were involved in active signal operations. We had our code machines and our other office equipment, as it were, in a garage, which was in the town of Cervaro, down the hill. And we were at the end of the town closest to the monastery, so that we worked under what seemed rather vulnerable conditions.
Yeah.
One of the messages I had to decipher was a message to our division telling us that at such and such an hour on the next day, the monastery was going to be bombed, because it was felt that the Germans were using it as an observation point. they weren't, but we honestly thought they were. And that was the most striking and distressing message I
Yeah.
ever deciphered or decoded during World War
It's a
II.
very historic monastery. Yeah. So, where in these couple of years that you're in North Africa, Italy, southern France, and the final push into Germany, do you remember having written the first poem that you've kept and published in your first book? Because when you publish the collected, you publish everything that's in all of the books that constitute the collected.
Well, I know that one of my first poems was written at a time when we were pulled back from the line and sent to a recreation area near Caserta. And I forget how many days of rest we had there. But I do remember exploring the garden of a wonderful building in that town. An old and historic building, but I can't name it now. And writing a poem about that. And then later, when we were pushing out of the Anzio beachhead, I forgot to mention that
Anzio.
that we moved over to Anzio after Cassino. As we were pushing north from the Anzio beachhead, I was asked to do some wire laying up to the front line, and the Jeep driver who took us out there, unhappily, on a later jaunt to the front line, overshot and was killed by German machine guns. And I wrote a poem about him called Tidewater. That was his name.
Yeah. Would you read one of these poems? I mean, I think during the course of the couple of hours we're going to be talking, it would make sense to
Sure.
to have you do that, and I brought the book.
This is when World War II was running down, and we were about to overrun the Germans after long stalling. First snow in Alsace. The snow came down last night like moths burned on the moon. It fell till dawn, covered the town with simple cloths. Absolute snow lies rumpled on what shell bursts, scattered and deranged, entangled railings, creviced lawn. As if it did not know they'd changed, snow smoothly clasps the roofs of homes, fear-gutted, trustless, and estranged. The ration stacks are milky domes. Across the ammunition pile, the snow has climbed in sparkling combs. You think, beyond the town a mile or two, this snowfall fills the eyes of soldiers dead a little while. Persons and persons in disguise, walking the new air white and fine, trade glances quick with shared surprise. At children's windows, heaped benign, as always, winter shines the most, and frost makes marvelous designs. The night guard, coming from his post, 10 first snows back in thought, walks slow and warms him with a boyish boast. He was the first to see the snow.
Thank you. So we're going to jump a little. The war is over. You're home. You're reunited with Charlie and Ellen.
Yes.
Did you go immediately to Harvard?
Yes, almost
on
immediately.
discharge.
So, I can't tell when I got wind of the GI Bill, but I was timely informed of its existence. And that immediately shaped my sense of what I would do with myself. I suppose I had imagined, if I survived the war, just blundering into the world of American newspapers,
Sure.
trying to find a niche there. But this sounded just right. And my friend Tom Wilcox staked out an apartment for us up in Cambridge, and up we went very soon after my return, and started into to do the graduate school thing. And I did achieve an MA by 1947, I think. And then, through extraordinary good luck, I was accepted into the Harvard Society of Fellows as a junior fellow. That meant that I was to have 3 years of good lunches and dinners,
Very good conversation.
and very good conversation with 24 young scholars and 8 or 9 imposing senior fellows, people like that meant that I found myself sitting at a dinner next to Alfred North Whitehead, for heaven's sake. That was all quite wonderful, and what the Harvard Society of Fellows required of you was simply that you make use of all of the advantages of the university, all of its libraries and so on, for 3 years, and come up with something if you could. And almost at once, because 2 of my Cambridge friends, one of them a fellow Pierre Schneider, the other André de Boucher, a French refugee who had gone to Amherst and then to Harvard Graduate School. Because I was much taken up with these 2 friends who introduced me to a lot of French literature, I felt an itch to go to France and follow up some special interests they'd awakened in me. So one thing I did as a junior fellow was to go to France with Charlie and catch the bug that was going to affect my future career for many years. She and I went to a wonderful, fresh production of Molière's The Misanthrope at the Comédie Française, starring Pierre Dux. And it had been freshly mounted so that the jaded French audience was utterly ravished by it, and their ravishment infected me, and in due time I became a translator and interpreter of much of Molière.
To some extent with Charlie's help, is that true? I mean, Charlie knew French, and
Yes, she knew French. She was very good with languages,
yeah,
and she checked me line by line at my request when I was translating anything. That she had an especially good touch with Molière.
Yeah.
Knew what he was up to, what the tone of voice was.
yeah, great. So you're back at Harvard, where you must have encountered Robert Frost during
Yes,
that time, right in the late 1940s.
yes,
Frost had left Amherst just before you arrived. That is to say, Frost lived in Amherst on Sunset Avenue from the mid-1920s, I think 1925, to 1938, when his wife Eleanor died. And Frost was, the story that I've always heard and read is that Robert Frost was so distressed by the death of his wife, such a profound change in his life, that he needed to move. He needed to leave Amherst, and he did, not to come back until 1948 as the Simpson lecturer. And in that interval, he was in Cambridge, I think, a good bit of the time, as well as in the winters and in the summers, of course, in Vermont mainly, I think
yes,
then. But you encountered him in Cambridge.
I did. I had hoped to encounter him at Amherst.
Yes, yes,
That was my one big disappointment about
Sure,
Amherst when I
sure.
came as a student there. But once I was through with the war and back and living in Cambridge, I did very soon meet Robert Frost, and Charlie's being my wife was a great advantage to me there, because her great aunt, Susan Hayes Ward, had been a great encourager of Robert Frost at a time when nobody else was encouraging him. He always referred to her as the first friend of my poetry. He used to go up to where the Ward and Hayes families lived in South Berwick, Maine, and read his poems to her. In fact, he wrote a poem at her insistence.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she said to him one day, when he had come to read poems to her, Robert, you've written that nice poem, Birches, for boys. Now you ought to do one for girls. And this story would be better if I could remember the name of the poem which she assigned to him. But she told him a story about her girlhood, and it had woods and trees in it, and a good little plot. And he executed a poem of about the length of Birches to gratify Susan Hayes Ward. I don't think he ever wrote a poem on demand for anybody else.
Right, except for the inauguration, right?
For the inauguration, which
A long time
I think
later.
he didn't like very well.
That's right. It's a poem for an inauguration. That's what it is, rather than a regular Robert Frost poem, so to say.
Yes.
What did Frost mean to you as a, not so much as a friend, but as a friend in the art?
He was the first person I ever heard give a poetry reading. When I was in high school, I remember taking the trolley car down to Montclair to hear Robert Frost read to the Women's Club of Montclair. He was traveling around the country in those days, reading just everywhere in order to make money for the care of his afflicted children.
Yes.
And so I think very early, I took in by ear some of the qualities of Frost that excited me in poetry. And by the time I met him in Cambridge, I think I had a very large part of his poetry by heart. So that although the important thing governing his kindness to Charlie and me was Charlie's family, he also thought well of me for having so much of him by heart.
I'll bet. Yeah.
And he was always very reserved in his encouragements, but he did take a kindly view of my poems. And when I came out with the first book in 1947, he didn't pat me on the head, but he called Charlie and spoke well of the book over the telephone. And
That's all you needed.
that was conveyed to me.
I'd ask you to read what I think of. I'm sure there are other candidates, but I think of this as your most Frostian poem. It is certainly one of my favorite poems that you've done, April 5th, 1974.
Yes, I admit that this is a Frostian poem. I hope it also sounds like me.
It does.
It's called April 5th, 1974.
This is April 7th, 2010, right? So
yes,
it's a weather poem.
Right, it is.
In different weather from the weather, summary weather today.
Yes, this is more summary.
Right.
The air was soft, the ground still cold. In the dull pasture where I strolled was something I could not believe. Dead grass appeared to slide and heave, though still too frozen flat to stir, and rocks to twitch and all to blur. What was this rippling of the land? Was matter getting out of hand and making free with natural law? I stopped and blinked, and then I saw a fact as eerie as a dream. There was a subtle flood of steam moving upon the face of things. It came from standing pools and springs, and what of snow was still around. It came of winters giving ground, so that the freeze was coming out, as when a set mind, blessed by doubt, relaxes into mother wit. Flowers, I said, will come of it. Too bad I loused up that next to the last line, relaxes into mother wit. Flowers, I said, will come of it.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks. So you finish at Harvard, having accumulated many pages on Edgar Allan Poe, as I understand it, many of them in print, and took your first job, which was at Harvard, right? I mean, you taught at Harvard for a couple of years, and then Wellesley a couple of years?
Yeah, the Society of Fellows had been created by one of Harvard's presidents who was a little impatient of the PhD program. And so it wasn't surprising that it was possible to move from 3 years in the Society of Fellows onto the faculty as a beginner. And I was taken into the English department, made an assistant professor, and I was classified as a what was the name of it? There was a program involving assistant professors who were teachers of writing, and they were not, however, promotional types. They were not going to remain in the Harvard English faculty.
There's something, I don't know if this is it, but there's something called the Briggs-Copeland?
Briggs Copeland, yes. I was a Briggs Copeland appointee. And so I was to be at Harvard for maybe 5 years. And I was to teach writing. Though I had only written 1 or 2 short stories in my life, I found myself teaching classes in the short story. But I was also allowed to teach a course in modern poetry, ending with Hart Crane, as I remember, and to teach in the rather exciting freshman humanities program which was just beginning at that time. And what else did I do? I did a seminar in Edgar Allan Poe, which had about 10 takers. Fortunately, they were very bright guys who kept discovering new things about Poe, as one could do. The reason why one could make discoveries in Poe was that Poe's scholarship had been very lame-brained until that time. I think Poe's scholarship was mostly of a factual nature, and that was because people who busied themselves with Poe's scholarship really didn't have much respect for Poe as a writer.
Yeah.
Didn't have any sense that there were depths in some of his work that were worth plumbing. Well, that was exciting, teaching that course to people who themselves made discoveries in Poe. Then on to Wellesley for 2 years, and in the midst of which I went to Rome.
Oh, to the American Academy.
Yes, I'd already scampered off to New Mexico in 1952 on a Guggenheim Fellowship, so I was rather in and out as a teacher in those days.
Where you settled was Wesleyan.
Wesleyan, and I was a real homesticker, as most teachers are not. I stayed at Wesleyan for 20 years at least. Well, you've been a homesticker at Amherst.
45.
Yeah.
And by this point, you must have had 3 children and maybe 4. I mean,
Yes.
The boys were born in succession after the war, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
one of whom I taught. I wish it to be recorded.
Oh, that's right. My
occasion.
son Nathan was
an Amherst alum.
Was an Amherst alumnus.
Yeah.
My son Christopher was accepted at Amherst, but something made him go to Harvard.
Don't know what. Yeah. So at Wesleyan, I want to come back to Amherst College in a second, but I'd like to hear a little something about what you did at Wesleyan for 20 plus years, and in the publishing, because you were heavily involved in the Wesleyan Poets.
Yes.
Publishing.
Well, in classes, I started out boldly teaching Shakespeare to a large class, and I didn't really go on to be a Shakespeare man. There were other people whose habit it was to teach Shakespeare, and I let them do it. Later, I did inherit the Milton course at Wesleyan, and that was a delight to me always.
So every year, for many years, you taught a Milton course.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're a writer, as I noticeably was by that time, people want you to teach writing courses, and so I did with pleasure. The only course I really hated teaching at Wesleyan was a course in remedial English, which I was asked to do 1 year, and which I was foolhardy enough to accept. The trouble was that I had never been any good at all on English grammar or French grammar, and just barely adequate in Latin grammar, because you can't get anywhere in Latin.
That's right.
Unless you acknowledge the existence of declensions and conjugations.
Right.
But I was willfully stupid about grammar always, and bored by it. I remember when I sold my first poem to the New Yorker, which was in 1948 or so. It was a poem about New Year's Eve. And I had a telephone call in latter December from Mrs. E.B. White from the New Yorker saying, Mr. Wilbur, we want to use your New Year's poem. Now, we have to go to press with it right away, so there won't be time for us to send you a proof. We'll have to talk it over the telephone. And I said, all right, Mrs. White. And she said, you don't seem to understand the difference between which and that. And I said, well, no, I don't, Mrs. White. It seems to me that which is a rough-sounding word, and that is a smooth-sounding word, and that's the best I can do. And she said, oh, well, after all, Fowler's usage is an English book. We'll let you have your mistakes. And so...
They didn't let many have their mistakes.
No. They were in a hurry, I guess, in this case. So...
Well, it changes the texture of a line.
It does indeed.
You know, you move from one of those words to the other.
Yes, but of course they didn't really want me to be ungrammatical. And so, well, I've always been as bad at grammar as I could be. And here I was teaching a course in remedial English at Wesleyan. Fortunately, among the students who had been obliged to take this course, there were a few who understood the principles of grammar, although they couldn't apply them. And so I spent a semester saying, Mr. So-and-so, can you tell us what grammatical rule would apply here? And
very resourceful.
Yes, they covered up for me the very students I was supposed to be instructing.
That's great. So when did you, do you remember, you may not remember, but first come back to the college after the war? Did you come back to do readings in the late 1940s, say, after your first book? Or
I came back, rather to my surprise, to every class reunion. And I turned into an old grad.
Yes.
And, but...
Here we are in the alumni house.
Yes. But what was the other thing?
The question is when you started doing readings of
Yes.
your own poems at the college.
Now, I can't say what the year of it was, but I think one of the first readings I gave was at Amherst, and Jimmy Merrill and
I was going to bring up Jimmy Merrill soon.
we gave a joint reading in the Octagon, and Jimmy did very well, although in subsequent writing he said he felt he had displayed all kinds of affectation.
Yeah, well.
And
Jimmy Merrill was 5 years younger than you, so he would have been quite young at that point.
Yes.
And not having himself pursued a graduate school. But you got to know him well as the years went on, especially once you started going to Key West, and he moved to Key West for the winters.
Yes, Charlie and I went to Key West for the first time in the middle 1960s. A colleague of mine at Wesleyan, the painter Sam Green, had said, why do you and Charlie always go to some place like Aruba during the winter vacation and spend all your money on airfare so that you can't stay very long? My suggestion, Sam said, is that you go to the American tropics. He'd just been visiting Key West and had made some charming paintings of that then dilapidated town. And he persuaded us to give it a try. And we were very fond of Key West right away. And before long, before 2 or 3 years of Key West visits had elapsed, we had found ourselves a house there, in a compound to which we had attracted some other writers. We introduced my friend John Chardy and John Hersey to Key West. And there began to be a number of our friends and their friends coming to the island until we constituted quite a writers' colony.
Good.
And a kind of a continuous cocktail party.
Was Hemingway around at all?
Hemingway had gone.
Yeah.
The only writer I remember who was there during our very first visit was Tennessee Williams.
Uh-huh.
He was pointed out to me in an Italian restaurant where Charlie and I were dining, and the waitress said, "Do you know about the very famous playwright Tennessee Williams?" I said, "Yeah, I know about him." And she said, "Well, he's right over there." And I said, "Which one is he?" And she said, "He's the little runt under the window." Well,
but you stayed with Key West for decades. Right?
Yes, and until Charlie's health made it clear that she was no longer going to be able to enjoy a tropical island. So we stayed on into the 80s.
Yeah, well, good. And when did you, I mean, I know it was when you were teaching at Wesleyan, but when did you acquire the Cummington property? This is where I come in, if that's right.
That was around 1964 or 5. We had been down in New Haven at Yale for a big old program in memory of Randall Jarrell, who had just died, and various
65.
Various people like John Crow Ransom, John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Adrienne Rich, Richard Eberhardt. We're down there to say a few words about him from a platform, and to read a few of his poems, and I was part of that. And Robert Penn Warren, who was also part of that.
And a faculty member at Yale. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. He said to me, "Do you have any money in the bank?" And I said, "Well, a little." He said, "Well, if you do, take it and go north from where you're teaching in Connecticut and buy up some of northern New England, because what's happening now is that everybody wants a second home, and terrible real estate speculators are coming down from Canada, coming in from other places, and they're flooding the valleys and calling it lakes, and surrounding these phony lakes with chalets. We've got to save some of New England's land from these people." And well, on the same occasion, Jonathan Aaron, an old friend of ours and the son of an old friend, Dan Aaron, said that his parents had just found a fine old house in Cummington, Massachusetts, for very little money, and maybe 100 acres of land to go with it. And as a matter of fact, they could well advise me as to the name of an honest real estate woman they had encountered there in Cummington. So, well, to be brief about it, we got in touch with the honest real estate woman, went up to Cummington and loved what we saw, and bought for almost no money at all a little shack
And a foundation, is that what I remember?
and a burnt out foundation,
Yeah.
a ruined tennis court, a ruined swimming pool, and 50 acres of woods. And by the time, by 1971, we had built a house in the burnt out foundation, and that became where we lived.
Yeah. Then you moved from Wesleyan to Smith, I
Yes.
assume in part because you were wanting to live in Cummington.
That's right. Yes. We were, after all, just a half an hour from Smith College.
Yeah.
Once we had moved to Cummington. And Smith kindly took me in.
Are you willing to say a word about a possibility that didn't get realized of coming to Amherst at some point with a...
I think I
You
shouldn't...
mentioned something to me once, and
Yeah.
this is the kind of occasion, these interviews, in which I think whoever is in charge of all of this thinks it's a good idea to speak a bit about Amherst, and if there, if any qualifications one has about one's loyalty to the, not that you have any qualifications, but there was talk at one point, right, of your
Yes.
coming to the Amherst English department, which
There was
I
a-
knew nothing about, although I was probably here at the time it happened.
Yes, I think you were. But there was a time when Harvard had offered me a job to come back to Harvard from Wesleyan. Wesleyan countered with a kind offer of giving me every third semester off with pay. That was going to help me as a writer, of course.
Sure.
And in this interval of dickering, I had a kind inquiry from Cal Plimpton, and came up and talked with Armour and one or two people about it. But the arrangement that Wesleyan had made was
Too good to-
altogether too kind, and so I stayed on
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
much as I was attracted to coming back to Amherst.
Eventually you did, and here you are.
I did.
Not at a young age did you come back, but I applaud the initiative of the administration in thinking to make you a Simpson lecturer. It's meant something to me, I would say, because Dick and I have been co-teaching, as I said at the very beginning of these 2 hours, what I think will be 2 hours, and we've had a good time doing it, at least by my lights. Do you want to say a word about how you find the current Amherst students as you've encountered them in the classroom?
I find them indubitably brighter than we were. They are, at any rate, the ones I've met
Yeah.
have been very, very lively, very well prepared for anything we had to offer them. The only thing the matter with them is that they use the word "like" in every sentence. It's
Even when we tell them not to, and
Yes.
we have done that.
we have
repeatedly.
indeed. Well, they're very good thinkers and readers, good writers. They're not good talkers, and perhaps
They're shy.
maybe it is. Maybe
Although
it
there's
is
also
shyness.
a kind of ethos at the college, and it has been this way for quite a while. Maybe this is more pronounced once coeducation came in which students seem to be more reluctant to speak eloquently or to try to speak eloquently in front of their peers. And it's a disappointment. I mean, I remember since I came here in 1965 and all the things that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s did happen while I was a young instructor and assistant professor here. The students were, and this was before coeducation, the students were truly passionately involved in class discussion, and there was no holding back, and it was a very exciting time to be a teacher, and you undoubtedly encountered that at Wesleyan as well. But the classroom itself has been muted a bit, I would claim. And I don't know if my little theory about coeducation and not wanting to be seen as showing off and pleasing teachers, and so it is a little hard to get the kind of conversation going in class that used to be pretty routine.
When I was teaching at Harvard, it was generally felt that though the girls from Radcliffe in our classes were in many cases the brightest of our students, that they suppressed their cleverness and their scholarly knowledge because they were in the presence of boys.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know whether the same theory obtained about the boys, but
It's a thought I've had over years, that the classroom is not quite the alive place that, and maybe this is just my getting a lot older. I've been here 45 years, and so you remember the early years as, with a kind of intensity for the intensity that
Yes.
you maybe projected onto the classroom. That does seem to me a shift, and lots of other people will offer the same kind of testimony. Well, I would say for posterity that this has meant a whole lot to me to be teaching with you, and of course to have known you all this time.
well, it's been wonderful for me to be hauled out of retirement.
Yes.
For 20 years, I hadn't taught a class.
That's right, you taught at Smith for 10 years and then stopped.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course,
So from age 65 to 85, if I may so say,
Yes.
you weren't teaching, you were writing.
and I'd forgotten
Translated.
everything I ever knew, as perhaps I display in class.
Never. Which reminds me to ask you to read a poem and maybe to recite one if you can. I would think an appropriate way to bring this to a conclusion would be to come back to where we nearly started, and that is to Charlie and your family. You were generous enough to ask me to speak at her memorial in the little church in Cummington after she died, and it was one of the truly moving occasions for me in my life, and an honor to be sure. Your poetry, since Charlie has gone, does seem to me to be focused on Charlie and your life without her.
I suppose it is, yes.
I think it is. And I was teaching In Memoriam, or a little bit of In Memoriam, Tennyson's In Memoriam the other day. And it occurred to me in the middle of a sentence when I was speaking about Tennyson and the loss of his great friend, Arthur Henry Hallam, when Hallam was 23 and Tennyson the same. And Tennyson spent, the next decade and a half writing this astonishing series of 100+ poems in memory of his friend, who was tabbed even when he was in his early 20s as a future Prime Minister of England. Well, it occurred to me in the middle of a sentence I was speaking about Tennyson and Hallam that you're engaged, and I've said this to the class, that you're engaged in a much smaller project of In Memoriam, Charlotte Hayes Wilbur.
Well, I probably am, without being programmatic or
Yes,
quite aware
yes,
of it.
Right, yeah. I don't mean to make you excessively aware of it, and I certainly don't want to stop it. But there are two poems. You begin the most recent. I know you have another book coming out this fall, so if anybody listens to this interview before then, I don't know when it'll be available, but maybe in time for that book, to be titled Anti-Rooms, which is going to begin, is it not, with the poem House? The
Yes,
House?
yes.
Would you be willing to read the reader?
Oh, yes.
And maybe to speak the poem House, if you
I
Can you
wish
do
I
that?
could.
Yeah. You didn't bring it with you, and I
unfortunately,
should have brought it with me.
My trouble is I greatly envy all my Russian poet friends who can say everything they've ever written from memory.
Yeah.
I find that I write so slowly and with so many changes that when I try to remember my poems, I remember various stages of composition,
Well, I do the
which
same.
is confusing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here is The Reader,
Yes,
which poem I did read at the memorial service.
yes. Charlie was a very great reader and very ashamed of me because I never finished reading War and Peace. She was a great consumer of the classic fiction, and this poem looks at her as she's reading. The reader. She is going back these days to the great stories that charmed her younger mind. A shaded light shines on the nape half shadowed by her curls, and a page turns now with a scuffing sound. Onward they come again, the orphans reaching for a first handhold in a stony world, the young provincials who at last look down on the city's maze and will descend into it, the serious girl once more who would live nobly, the sly one who aspires to marry so, the young man bent on glory, and that other who seeks a burden. Knowing as she does what will become of them in bloody field or Tuscan garden, it may be that at times she sees their first and final selves at once, as a God might, to whom all time is now. Or having lived so much herself, perhaps she meets them this time with a wiser eye, noting that Julien's calculating head is from the first too severed from his heart. But the true wonder of it is that she, for all that she may know of consequences, still turns enchanted to the next bright page, like some Natasha in the ballroom door, caught in the flow of things wherever bound, the blind delight of being, ready still to enter life on life and see them through. I probably should have an available index of that poem in the back of the book,
Yes.
letting people know what novels I have in mind. But
Yeah.
the fellow who seeks a burden is Stavrogan in the Possessed.
Yes.
In the translation I read,
Yes.
he says, "I seek a burden."
Aha. Aha. I had wondered about that, and although I've read The Possessed, I read it when I was a student. It occurred to me as you were reading, maybe another way to return it to the larger world, to return our talk to the larger world, would be to have you read another Amherst poem about a poet, and I can imagine there are people who will be watching and listening to this who would appreciate your doing the Emily Dickinson poem, Altitudes.
Yes.
And then we really will stop, although we could go on.
All right. Yes, this is a two-part poem. In the first part, one is somewhere in Europe, in Catholic Europe, looking up into the dome of a cathedral. And in the second part, one is back in Amherst, Massachusetts. Altitudes, part one. Look up into the dome. It is a great salon, a brilliant place, yet not too splendid for the race whom we imagine there, wholly at home with the gold-rosetted white wainscot, the oval windows, and the faultless figures of the painted vault. Strolling, conversing in that precious light, they chat, no doubt, of love. The pleasant burden of their courtesy borne down at times to you and me, where in this dark we stand and gaze above. For all they cannot share, all that the world cannot in fact afford, their lofty premises are floored with the massed voices of continual prayer. Part 2. How far it is from here to Emily Dickinson's father's house in America. Think of her climbing a spiral stair up to the little cupola with its clear small panes, its room for one. Like the dark house below, so full of eyes in mirrors and of shut-in flies, this chamber furnished only with the sun is she and she alone. A mood to which she rises, in which she sees bird choristers in all the trees and a wild shining of the pure unknown on Amherst. This is caught in the dormers of a neighbor, who no doubt will before long be coming out to pace about his garden, lost in thought. That would, in a literal construction of that poem, that would be her brother Austin.
That's right, in the Evergreens.
Yes, but I mean him to represent so many Americans of that generation who were making up their own religion for themselves, and sometimes with help from India.
Yes. Well, Dick, thank you very much.
Well,
It's